Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss the two most recent developments in the seemingly secret US trade deal talks that the UK is carrying out. And they are the furthest things from being in Britain's national interest. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, to avoid spending ages recovering old ground, I'll go over the main points of interest for those who haven't been keeping up with this really quickly before the latest piece of nonsense. So, one, the US published their proposals for a US-UK trade deal over a year ago. They had no problems doing so because it's in their favour. The UK, you will notice, has not published any proposals for a trade deal with anyone. This is because they cannot possibly think of a trade deal proposal that could possibly be better than the one we have either with the EU or via the EU, because remember, we have trade arrangements with the US, with Japan, with all sorts as a result of this. Interestingly, Liz Truss, Minister, was just saying that she's about to publish her proposals for a great trade deal with Japan that would involve a boost to trade. And you look at that and you think, we have a free trade deal with Japan right now as, well, not a member of the EU anymore, now a member of the transition period. How do you get better than a free trade deal? Whatever deal we come up with Japan, which will not be for years, even if it's exactly the same, cannot possibly be a boost to trade because it can't be better than a free trade deal. But anyway, never mind that. Back onto the second point with the US trade deal. So, because of the bad publicity that surrounded the details of the US's proposals, which, as I say, they were perfectly open and honest about last year, UK and US ministers and officials were meeting in secret last year to discuss the trade deal. But notes were leaked that revealed that, amongst other things, the UK accepted that the US would not give us a trade deal if we also had a trade deal with the EU. That meant we had to sacrifice the EU trade deal. And that also we would have to completely sell off the NHS, with preference, of course, going to US insurance companies. And then the third point was that at the start of 2020, the US publicly said that they weren't going to carry on discussing a trade deal with the UK. Donald Trump was in a hissy fit about the Huawei decision. And so that looked like that. But I'd said at the time, because of something else, UK lawyers were forced to admit in court that the UK was holding secret trade talks with at least one nation. They wouldn't say what nation it was, but they did have to admit that these were going on. I wondered at the time if this was actually the US and that the US was just publicly saying these talks weren't going ahead. Well, on to the more recent news, and of course it seems that the US must be at least one of those countries which the UK is holding secret talks with because things have progressed. On to the more recent news. So it was reported in the last couple of weeks that the US were insisting on certain aspects of the trade talks not being disclosed to the public. In addition, that some of these aspects mustn't be disclosed to the British public, which of course means any public, because if they disclose it to the American public, it'd soon get over here, for up to 5 years from the actual implementation of the deal itself. So basically, we're not even allowed to know what was discussed once the trade deal has been implemented. Not for 5 years. It's got to be properly embedded to the point where you can't really unpick it at that point. Now ask yourself, why would that be? Not only are the discussions to be kept from the British public, which is appalling, but we can't even be told about them 5 years after the trade deal is put in place. This can only be because such revelations would be so devastating and there'd be such a public backlash that we wouldn't possibly go through with such a trade deal. And we, so we're not going to be told until it's too late, basically. And not just once the deal is agreed. It's not a case of once it's all signed and sealed, then we can be told. No. 5 years later for some of it. So in other words, what are you thinking that's going to be? Well, that's going to be once the NHS has been completely sold off to the point where no one can do anything about it anymore. And well, any government coming in at that point couldn't turn it around overnight. If you look at the situation with the NHS, for example, now, if a new government came in theory, they could just start dispensing with the private contracts and start hiring properly and start to organise the NHS back into a national organisation instead of the broken up little trust that it exists in now. But once it is completely sold off, then it's much more difficult to do that because the infrastructure will no longer exist. But that in itself was not something that rose to the top of my priority list for video topics. You might think it would be, but after all, the deal isn't in Britain's interests was already the case. This just makes it different. It made no difference to me what the details were, whether they were going to be public or not, because the Conservatives, as far as I was concerned, have conned so much of the public into going along with Brexit, which is as devastating a thing you can imagine for Britain as possible. Why wouldn't they be able to sell the US trade deal as well? In addition, the way that Boris Johnson is conducting trade talks with the EU would make a US trade deal all but impossible anyway. Because if the US Congress takes the view that Boris Johnson has breached the Good Friday Agreement, which his rhetoric so far suggests he's about to, then, well, they have promised not to sign off on any trade deal with the UK. So, in some ways, it would be a bit of a non-story. Interesting, but not really anything that changes the situation. But this week, there was an even more embarrassing revelation being reported, which actually does change the scenario. So, the US government now have been pushing the UK to accept a clause in the deal that essentially says that if we agree a trade deal with another country and the US don't like it, that they can withdraw from any parts of our trade deal that they like. It's all perfectly above board. In other words, at this point, it wouldn't be a deal at all because, a deal is a series of obligations that each side accepts in return for benefits that outweigh those responsibilities. But such a clause would mean that the US has no obligations at all because they can unilaterally decide that they don't like us arranging, a trade deal with the EU or China or anyone else, and then they can just cancel parts of the deal with us. But we don't get to do likewise. We would still have to fulfil our obligations. The result of this is literally signing up to an international treaty that involves us pulling our trousers down and the US doesn't have to do anything. It can just decide to kick us up the arse, shove a carrot up our arse, do whatever it likes. They don't have to do anything. All of the downsides are on our part. Now, Boris Johnson isn't reported to have agreed to this yet, but he has agreed to everything leading up to it. British diplomats are reported to be seeing this as trying to get leverage over Johnson's insistence on allowing Huawei to build part of our 5G network. That thing is still rumbling on. It's a way to prevent closer alignment with China. Not that the US really need fear that as such, because if our government were ever going to align itself away from the US, which would be remarkable, surely it wouldn't be towards China. The better bet would be Europe. China is far too closed to allow any genuinely close relationship with anyone, much less a cavalier Western nation whose civil service will regularly leak secret undertakings that are not in the public interest. That's how we know about this. Essentially, this clause would make a complete mockery of the ideals of Brexit and should be opposed by people on both sides of the debate. Brexit was supposed to be about taking back control, but this clause means that the US can tell us to reject any trade deal with any nation. So we get our trade deal. We're supposed to be able to make any trade deal we like. We start negotiating a trade deal with China. US goes, no, we don't like that. You're not doing that. And we have to follow suit. Because if we don't, then they will pull out of their obligations in our deal and we will not be able to do the same. And make no mistake, Conservative backbenchers are well up for this sort of thing. They'd love the UK to become the 51st state. George Osborne, the former Chancellor, seemed to think that Johnson would resist this on the basis that I was talking about earlier, that he had done so regarding Huawei when Trump spat his dummy out. And to be honest, that surprised me. But resisting the orange one, who may not be in power when we get to the business end of these negotiations, is one thing. But resisting your own backbenchers is quite another. Yes, some of those were also opposed to Huawei's involvement, but not as strongly and not as many of them as are in favour of this US trade deal on any terms. So I would view this prospect of the US proposal as a serious threat to our future economic well-being. Diplomats are certainly treating it seriously. So that in itself would ring alarm bells. They're now pushing for the UK to agree something with China. Obviously, it can't get a trade deal with China just yet, but push towards some sort of agreement with China in order to put pressure on the EU and the US to change their stance a little bit as well. But although I wouldn't have expected this particular path exactly, Brexit was always going to be the opposite of the global freedom that it claimed to be. You know, there is no such thing as actually genuinely engaging in free, independent trade negotiations out in the world, because all countries have other countries that will be looking over their shoulder when you do these things. For example, Liz Truss, going back to Liz Truss talking about doing a deal with Japan. Japan has a free trade deal with the EU. So when we are negotiating with Japan, the EU will be at Japan's side going, we don't like that bit's okay. And Japan has said that. They have said that they are very happy to talk to the British government. They're very happy to discuss a trade deal, but they won't be concluding anything until we have concluded our deal with the EU. I mean, the situation is we have gone from being one of the 3 head honchos in the largest trading bloc in the world, and we have chosen international isolation as if that's somehow the same as freedom. How could it have ever worked out? But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.